Hello, everyone in the virtual space. Good afternoon. My name is Luna Allen Bakarian, and on behalf of the Citizens League team, I would like to welcome you to today's Mind Opener conversation, which we're very excited for. I'm the policy director at the League, where for almost 75 years, we have been engaging Minnesotans in civic engagement and public policy work for a better Minnesota for all. And one of the ways that we do that is through event series like Mind Openers, where we put a policy topic forward and we invite multiple perspectives to share so that we can all learn and be further engaged with more information in that space. And so today, we are thrilled to have a really robust panel to speak about the future of small, local, and cultural media. And to give as much time as possible for that conversation, I'm going to welcome our panel and our executive director, Jake Loesch, who will be moderating and whose own career is at the intersections of politics, policy, governance, media, communications. So we are going to have a great conversation this afternoon. And thank you again to all of you for your civic engagement on a sunny summer Wednesday. Jake, over to you.
Thanks, Luna. And thanks everybody for joining us today. Again, as Luna mentioned, my name is Jake Loesch. I am the Executive Director of Citizens League. I've been in this role for about 2 years now, and really thrilled about this conversation and the panel that we have lined up for you today. Certainly, there's been no shortage of news coverage and conversation amongst our communities about small local cultural media and the role that news plays in our lives. News is the news these days, it feels like sometimes, and so we're really grateful to our panel, all of whom represent different kind of angles and perspectives on this topic. So we're going to get started today. I am just going to go through and give each of our panelists the opportunity to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about their organization's history and focus. And then we've got a great lineup of some questions to dig in on. For those of you tuning in and listening, we would love your conversation or your questions as well. So please feel free to use the chat for that. We will do our best to get to as many of them, but I'm certain there will be some great conversation and questions to have from the panel and the audience. So thank you all very much for joining us. I think let's just start. I'll kind of go through the list here. Tanner, would you mind kicking us off? Just kind of tell us about MinnPost and your history, and then we'll go through everyone else.
Yeah. Thanks, Jake. Thanks for having me. I'm Tanner Curl. I'm the executive director of MinnPost. We're an independent nonprofit news outlet. We serve as a trusted guide for all Minnesotans exploring the critical challenges, opportunities facing our state. MinnPost has been around. We'll be turning 18 years old, full-grown adults this November. We were founded in 2007. And MinnPost was really in this vanguard of the nonprofit business model. Advertising was going away as part of the traditional model. And as I always like to say, news could no longer be the happy byproduct of commercial interest. So there really is a public service, a public good, and having that model with philanthropic support behind it being a part of that. In terms of our focus, we are a statewide focus. I think we're most known for state and local government coverage. Very deep explanatory reporting. In normal terms, we talk about that in terms of taking our audiences beyond the what and the when into the how and the why so that they're equipped, engaged, and can be involved in shaping the future of our communities of Minnesota. And in terms of our audience, we're fully digital. We reach audience directly through our site, through social media, through email newsletters. We reach hundreds of thousands of Minnesotans every month that way. But we also, as part of our model, we do not have a paywall. All of our journalism is free and accessible for all, thanks to the philanthropic support that we receive. And we also reach and serve Minnesotans through dozens of republication partners, whether that's community outlets, newspapers across the state that republish our work for free. So yeah, that's MinnPost in a nutshell.
Fantastic. Thanks for being here, Tanner. Alexis, can I go to you next to introduce yourself and tell us about the Daily?
My name is Alexis Letang. I'm the editor-in-chief at the Minnesota Daily. The Daily is the University of Minnesota's student-run newspaper. We cover pretty much anything that happens on campus, near campus. We've been around we're going into our 126th year. And our audience is mostly students and faculty, just because we have access to their emails, and so our newsletters automatically get sent to them. But then also just community members who are interested in what's happening around them as well.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for being here today. Heather, can I go to you next?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Heather Kantrud. I am the General Manager of Daily Journal Media. We are a WIC Communications newspaper in Fergus Falls, Minnesota. I am also the Managing Editor of the Madison Daily Leader out of Madison, South Dakota, another WIC Communications newspaper. Daily Journal Media has been open for 152 years as of July.
Happy birthday.
Thank you. We just had our birthday. So yeah, we've been around. We've been around, and we have been the newspaper, the legal newspaper representative of our county pretty much since our inception.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for being here. Vanan, can I go to you next?
Sure. Thank you. Thanks for having me here. Wow. So my name is Vanan. I'm the executive director of Sahan Journal. Sahan Journal was founded in 2019. So compared to some of the numbers and ages thrown out today, we feel we are a child, we are a toddler. And so I'll try to not behave like one. But yeah, we were founded in 2019, and our mission is to provide communities of color in Minnesota with fair and responsive journalism, coverage that not only just reflects their experiences, but helps show the way towards a more equitable future for all Minnesotans. It was launched by Mukhtar Ibrahim, who saw how immigrant communities were often either overlooked, misunderstood, misrepresented in the mainstream media. So there was a sense of frustration with him, from him. And, thanks to Tanner and the folks at MinnPost, they were the trailblazers on what nonprofit newsrooms could look like in Minnesota. And, that's what he built on. Our team, Sahan, we cover issues like immigration, education, housing, public health, but through the lens of the communities that we represent. A lot of our journalists have lived experiences that mirror the communities that they cover. And then a little bit about our audience here. We often say our audience is Minnesota's communities of color, but the truth of the matter is our most loyal readers tend to be the ones that are civically engaged, they're more resourced, and oftentimes second-generation immigrants. And so that's something we're thinking a lot to. How do we make our work a little bit more accessible to those audiences that tend to be an alternative source of news forms? So a lot of things that we're growing right now, a lot to learn from the folks that are on this panel today. But yeah, the need has always been there. And so we intend to meet that mission.
Wonderful. So glad you're here. Thank you. And last but certainly not least, Tim, can you tell us a little bit about McKnight and Press Forward?
Yeah, thanks, Jake. And maybe least, I don't know, who knows, who's counting. But it's good to be here with all of these folks, some of whom are partners and some new faces. It's nice to meet you, Heather and Alexis. And I just want to say thanks to the Citizens League for hosting this conversation. And from where I sit to, within the 5 years that I've been working on this issue of local journalism, to have it not be bisected as something that's happening over here, but actually integrated into how we think about civic life and civic engagement is like incredibly important. And just want to say thank you for bringing us together. But anyways, hi everyone. Tim Murphy. I'm a program officer at the McKnight Foundation, and I lead our local media work. And in addition to that, I'm also on the leadership team of Press Forward Minnesota, which is a statewide philanthropic initiative that aims to revitalize local news across the state. And so there's a bunch more that we're going to unpack later in the conversation I could say about that. But I do think it's important to say that McKnight Foundation is around 75 years old. So Vanna, not quite as young as you, but also I was thinking that was pretty old, and we're half as old as Heather and in the Minnesota Daily as well. So but we are focused on climate and racial equity as the highest expression of our mission. And as a part of the foundation's work, we understand that without a healthy and vibrant and representative democracy, Without a local media environment that actually keeps citizens engaged, informed, and activated and inspired, I would say, and without policy that reflects the will of the people, any progress on any of our issues that any of us care about becomes really, really hard. And so for us, this shift towards local news and supporting local news, really doubling down on that over the last 5 years, has made sense for all of those reasons. And many, many more, as we know the industry is facing headwinds, and it's going to take a lot of collaborative solutions to continue to bolster it and make it more resilient. So that's just a little bit about me, and I'm looking forward to digging into the conversation with the rest of the panelists.
Great. Thanks, Tim. Yeah, I mean, I would say for us at Citizens League, the local news is obviously plays a major role in civic engagement and how residents of the state are informed and aware of what's going on at the Capitol and in local government. There is such a critical component to that education and engagement for people across the state. And so I think we tried very hard and are very grateful to you all for representing such a range of both, ages of outlets, geography. I think it's a lot of different needs and challenges and opportunities around the state. So we're really looking forward to digging in. I think the first question I'd like to start out with, really, I mean, it's something that's been a lot of focus and conversation in the news lately about federal funding and defunding of public media. But I'd love to hear more a little bit from each of you about, I mean, funding is such a key aspect, right? News doesn't happen for free. You have salaries and there's a lot of things that have to be paid for in order to produce news. It doesn't just exist out of nowhere. And so obviously how you fund operations is a big aspect of this component. And I think a real reality that we've seen as a lot of local outlets have simply not been able to continue funding and keeping their operations going. So I'm curious, and I'd open this up to the whole panel, how you are considering those evolving and changing approaches to reaching audiences, and if you've had to change or adjust anything about your funding and your staffing levels in response to those funding challenges that we're all seeing, and that certainly I know many of you are feeling.
I can jump in and go first. So with MinnPost, I mean, and being 18 years old, we were part of the founding of the Institute of Nonprofit News, which is part of this national consortium of nonprofit news outlets. We were one of 35 founding members about 15 years ago that now has almost 500 member organizations. So, like Vanan said, with Sahan Journal here, there's other nonprofit outlets in Minnesota, but this is a huge burgeoning movement across the country. And the way that model works is having a real diversity of revenue sources. Certainly individual giving for us is the biggest one. Almost between a half and 2/3 of our annual budget comes from individual donors. But even that is really well diversified in terms of people who are giving $5 a month, $10 a month, and some people who are making, larger, more significant amounts and so forth. But then we're honored to have grant support from great funders like McKnight Foundation and other foundations, both local and national, as well as local advertising sponsorship partners. So we have a very, I would say, robust, diversified revenue set, which allows us, if there's any kind of, an economic situation creates a wobble on one area, that gives us a little bit more stability. In terms of federal funding, we don't receive any direct federal funding in any kind of ongoing way. So those have not directly impacted us, but we are focused on the ecosystem and thinking about the ecosystem. I will point, we actually had a great story last week looking at effects of decrease to public broadcasting funds in rural Minnesota, particularly where you see these community outlets where it might be the only outlet in town or has this unique space, and a huge part of their federal funding, or a huge part of their funding overall comes from federal funding. And so looking at, in ways that we do even more than now, how can we partner? How can we bolster that part of the ecosystem? Because for us, this is not a zero-sum game. This is really thinking about serving Minnesotans and being that critical part of the civic infrastructure. How do we make sure those partners can withstand these shifts and changes, and in what role can we play?
Yeah, thanks, Tanner. I appreciate that.
I could take
Please,
a stab
yeah.
at. Yeah, sure. So a little bit different than what Tanner just mentioned, even though we're still within the space. We are a So we were talking about a baby here. So we are primarily still funded through philanthropy, grants from national and local foundations. We do also have a robust individual donations membership, not as strong as MinnPost, but that's something that we are aspiring to. And we also have actually a very good earned income revenue strategy from advertising. In fact, we are one of the better news organizations in the independent newsroom country that's doing it. I will say, we don't like MinnPost. We also don't get federal funding, and so that's at this moment is a bit of a blessing in disguise. But one of the things that can happen for a new startup is that national funders they tend to fund the startup to catalyze the action, but there is an expectation that local funders step in to continue the sustainability, which makes a lot of sense because local funders should care about what's happening around the local area. So that's one piece to talk about. And even though we are a nonprofit newsroom that relies on ad dollars, we are also impacted by the shrinking ad dollars for all newsrooms. And so that's something that we are that's striking, that's hitting us, and that's something that we have to find a solution for. And I would say the one thing that's also very interesting is that new audiences, like we want to reach new audiences, but we all know younger audiences. I think that the study that Presswell even put out a while back, they don't pay for news in the traditional sense, right? And so because they often get their news source through alternative formats, and so the challenge for newsrooms is how do we continue to provide value to them? What's our value proposition in a way that will encourage them to pay for the content that we're providing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Alexis, maybe I could go to you next on that, kind of in that vein, younger people viewing news differently, how they might pay for it. How is that feeling for the Daily as a, primarily, as you were mentioning, focus on kind of students and reporting on the news? How does the funding work for the Minnesota Daily?
Yeah, so for the Daily, we have student service fees, which is included in part of the student's tuition. And that gets used to pay all of the student workers. And then it's a similar process for like also our student government. The student service fees just allows for like access to different services. And so that's just kind of how we pay our student workers. We have advertising and we raise money through different events. We have a 5K coming up. And there's also like the university hosts Give to the Max Day. So we do fundraising through there. And so that's kind of how we that's how we fund ourselves, or that's how we are funded. So we don't, especially because our audience is college students, we're not likely to get people to pay for the news that we have.
It's interesting that it's built into those student fees that students pay to attend the U, correct?
Yeah, and they can opt out of it, but it benefits them overall just because it gives access to other things.
Great, thanks. Heather, I assume the Fergus Falls Daily Journal is a little more of a kind of traditional subscriber model, but just curious about how funding, how that situation is looking for you all.
We are a traditional subscriber model. However, from the newsroom side of the perspective, as we see a lot of this public funding being pulled back, and we're waiting to see how places like NPR respond to that, who have reporters, scattered all over the place, including a good friend and former reporter here. If they have to pull out of some of these smaller communities, leaving them in even more of a news desert than they were already in, we're looking at how we can help step in to fill those gaps and what that looks like for us.
Thanks. Tim, I think maybe going to you next, I'm curious if you can keeping on the funding topic for just a little bit, and certainly this renewed interest from philanthropy in investing in local news, maybe a little bit about how, I know Press Forward is really a national effort with kind of different state chapters around. curious to hear about, the origins of that and why McKnight felt it was important to lead the local effort, and if any of these recent federal conversations have impacted or changed how you're looking at the work here.
Yeah. Yeah, great question. And maybe I'll tie it to your last question too, Jake, around just sort of the overall environment for local news. And I think that's a good sort of start because that ties into Press Forward and its founding. So I'll just do like a meta level. Folks on this call may, already know this, so I'm not going to go super deep into it. But basically, the business model for local news has been significantly altered. I would say flipped on its head over the last roughly 20 to 25 years, in which advertising dollars used to drive the majority of the journalism work that was happening at different publishers around the country. And so as we increasingly sort of transitioned into a digital environment where ad dollars now were a lot more targeted and focused through companies like Google and Facebook and Meta and X, et cetera, it's left newsrooms scrambling to make up that significant chunk of what used to be reliable funding that would power the journalism. So that's sort of one of the main drivers that you've seen, what Heather alluded to, this rise in news deserts. So since 2005, and this is not, I don't know if this is most current data, but it's somewhere in that realm. Over 2,000 local newspapers shut down, leaving about 20% of Americans in what we call news deserts, which basically means there's not a single reporter, not a single news outlet that's covering what's happening in the community. And so what that means is folks don't know what's happening at their city council. They don't know what's happening at their school board meetings. They don't understand why a certain lot is being developed over here. We've seen a lot of this. The Star Tribune has done some great reporting on data centers, for instance, and so how development plays into civic engagement and how communities have choice and power and what's happening in their communities without access to that news and information. It becomes pretty bleak, and it becomes hard for folks to understand where they can have influence and agency in their communities. So as a part of some of these just overall trends and decline in just the number of reporters and news outlets and consolidation of social media networks, et cetera, major philanthropic organizations recognize the threat that this poses to community cohesion and democratic participation, frankly. So in early 2022, it was roughly a series of meetings and gatherings by some of the leading funders in this space, including Knight Foundation, which is based in Miami, MacArthur Foundation based in Chicago, Ford Foundation, and a few others met together to kind of put their heads around what some sort of philanthropic response to this environment, this declining local news environment, could look like. And essentially what they came up with is Jake, to your question now, this idea of Press Forward, which is really just a broad coalition at the national level with local chapters. I believe there are now over 40 local chapters in the state. And those initial folks who were at those meetings back in 2021, 2022 pledged more than $500 million over 5 years to this initiative to strengthen local news across the country. And what is really, I think, brilliant about the initiative is it's great to get those big headlines at the national level and great to see big foundations coming in and supporting. But it's really the local chapter strategy that I think is really going to bear fruit and prove out to be the beneficial choice point over the long run. And Tanner, for instance, sits on our host committee here in Press Forward, Minnesota, which is really engaging local knowledge and local leaders to develop solutions that will power this industry forward and hopefully not just return to status quo, but build a media ecosystem that is better for everyone going forward in the generations ahead. And so a big part of that is going to be philanthropic support. So we're fundraising at the local level. There are only so many philanthropic dollars, though. And so a big part of the chapter's work as well is having conversations like this and working with the general public and policymakers and civic leaders and business leaders to help understand how dire this issue is in Minnesota, and that if we lose local reporting, we lose access to or local publishers are going out of business. It poses significant dangers to our collective civic health and to our democracy, frankly. And so that's the work chart. That's what's in front of us. It's not going to be an easy sort of one size fits all solution, but this is where the ingenuity and creativity comes in with many of our partners, and why philanthropy, although we're kind of Press Forward is associated with philanthropy, we're really relying on the local leaders and the local experts and community members to help drive the initiative.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. There's such an urgency around this and supporting that, the continuing to make sure that we have that sort of robust local news sources for people around the state. Vaughn, and I'm going to go to you next. Intriguingly, a 2024 study, I think from the U of M, found that about 12% of all local news outlets in Minnesota have closed since 2018. I think this averages to be about 11 every year. Yet at the same time, there have been dozens of new local digital community specific outlets that have opened. So we've seen a lot of closures. We've also seen new outlets opening, Sahan Journal being one of those in 2019. I'm curious if you can tell us a little bit about, obviously opening in that environment has to be tricky, has to be challenging. It's something certainly on everyone's mind. How have you managed to build an audience and thrive despite what is obviously some kind of an uphill battle in the news ecosphere, in the ecosystem?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think there's a confluence of several things that allowed us to be where we're at right now. I would say one thing. I know you used the word like thrive. I mean, I think I would say we are still building and we're still growing.
Sure.
I think the big part is that there was a space that was clearly missing in the ecosystem at the time of creation, and there was a very, very, I would say, clear sense of purpose from the organization, from the founders to meet that moment, right? Sahan was not created to like save journalism. It was created because there was this space. There wasn't a newsroom. There wasn't a dedicated newsroom that's fully 100% focused on immigrants of communities of color. So the gap was there at that time. The gap still exists right now, and so that's what it is. And so we are also very intentional when it comes to audience growth. We've been very intentional about covering, the topics education, immigration, health, housing with depth and with people with a human touch behind the coverage that oftentimes can be missing within legacy media. And so the act of being consistent, that was the clear. You start with the clear focus, but continuing with that consistency over, the last 5-6 years has allowed us to build trust slowly. I don't think we had a really viral moment that allowed everyone to just learn about Sahan. I should check with my chief editor actually, but I don't think we had that viral moment where Sahan just exploded in space, which can happen to some spaces, but that was not with Sahan, right? So it was a very, I'm going to stick with my story. It was a slow growth built based on trust, and I think it's really cool that I am less than a year into the situation, into this role, and I'm continually surprised to meet people that tell me about the good work that the reporters do, and I find them in the most strangest places at times. And I would say though, when it comes to about the audience, and in the recent months, I think a lot of us can safely say that there's a lot of noise, there's a lot of misinformation as well, right? And so the trust that we built preceding this in all the issues that matter right now around immigration, our audience automatically has thankfully turned to us as this steady, reliable source, and that's why we're continuing to double down on that and take that role seriously. And I did start with a bit of mentioning that we're trying to grow, and that's the truth. We're not done yet. We still have pockets of audiences that don't interact and engage with our content. That's what we're trying to go towards too.
That's great. I appreciate that a lot. And I'm going to go kind of to the oldest then, Heather, back to you, as an outlet that has been reporting on the news since I believe 1873, right? We're over 150 years. And obviously seems to be one of those local news outlets that's somewhat bucking this trend. I'm curious if there's anything you can point to that why that may be, how the Fergus Falls community has rallied around your reporting, and how you kind of managed to maintain operations in what is obviously a difficult environment for local news.
Yeah, we certainly aren't immune to any of the issues that anyone else is experiencing. We're seeing those same issues as well. However, we do have that long-standing relationship with the community, which certainly helps. Being a newspaper that's been here and has the longevity that we have, we've been able to build and maintain relationships, and relationships can oftentimes be a game changer when it comes to keeping a newspaper open. We also have really great leadership, and I can't say enough about that. They're very forward thinking. They do the research. keep up with the trends. They try to stay ahead of the curve and keep up with the trend line. We started going digital a little bit before it was the cool thing to do, or the necessary thing to do, I guess I should say. Maybe we started interacting with social media as soon as we possibly could. We're a company that operates within its financial means. If we don't have the money to do it, we don't, even if we want to, which is another thing that's been very, very important. When it comes to AI, instead of immediately, shutting down as soon as people started talking about generative AI, we started looking at ways that we could use it as a positive tool ethically and in the right way. And we continue to look at that. We continue to involve other things that maybe aren't traditionally part of a typical newspaper. WIC Communications now has a television news station out in Washington State. To be fair, here in Minnesota, we have not done any work with that television news station, but that's just one example. We do have a YouTube station. We do some video recording. Slowly getting into it, but doing what we can with the resources that we have. We've been putting out digital newsletters, which have been a big deal. We do have a hard paywall, and we found that we've had to. However, we have newsletters that are free to anyone who wants to receive them. We'll try things, and they may work and they may not, but it's an industry in which we need to be willing to try different things and learn whether or not they're going to work for us, or if we aren't, or if it isn't. And sometimes it's scary, and sometimes sometimes it's more work for a while until we create a new normal. But I think in the news industry, we're going to be in a place for quite some time where we have to be willing to adapt, and we can't just stick to the way that it's always been done. And I feel like WIC Communications as a company has been very good at coming up with ideas and brainstorming ways that we can remain relevant in an industry that is needing to change, and that requires change in order to stay relevant in such a tough social climate.
Yeah. That challenge of knowing we need to innovate and take risks and do things differently, but also limited by the resources that we have, and how much can we do and how fast can we move, and the inherent risks involved with that, right? If it doesn't work, is it going to create more problems down the road? That's such a tension point, and always a difficult thing to figure out. You kind of brought us to my next question, actually, so I'm just going to go right there. We live in just such a world of increasingly fast technological advancement. I mean, you mentioned it, Heather, but I feel like it wasn't that long ago that AI was barely in the public's consciousness as something. I mean, it was certainly around, but it wasn't so ubiquitous as it has become, what feels like seemingly overnight. And so I'm curious just how you all react, how you're reacting to that, how you're thinking about it. How do you see technology, whether AI or other opportunities, creating challenges or opportunities for you in your reporting? And are you incorporating AI in any way to how you are reporting on news?
Do you want me to continue?
Sure, if you don't mind kicking us off, I'd love to hear where you're at on that.
Yeah, absolutely. We actually have a really great intern right now. He's a journalism intern, and he created our own AI for our company called WicBot. And it's still in the learning stages right now, but he's updated like the AP style guide. It helps with generation of headlines. It helps generate ideas for follow-up stories if you copy and paste your article content in there. And the best part about it is when we copy and paste our stuff into there, we're not giving up any of our copyright. We still retain all of that. So there are certainly ways that we can use AI to our benefit. Things like transcription tools that are, of course, within safe to use, using it to take information that's already public knowledge and maybe summarize it in a way that's going to be easier and quicker for us to put in a usable format for us to reuse. There are going to be completely unethical ways to use it too. I'm not going to grab an article from the Star Tribune and tell AI to rewrite it for me just so I can use it and slap my name on it. Like, that's not ethical. I'm not going to do it. And it shouldn't be done. And but there are certainly ways that I can take AI and use it to my advantage that is not going to create any issues at all, like asking it specific, editing stylistic questions like, what's the appropriate way to write 6'5" and 3/4 inches in AP style, or something along those lines that's just quicker than trying to look it up in the style guide online or in a book. It can absolutely be helpful. It can absolutely be harmful. And staying on top of that is another thing that is almost a full-time job. But it's definitely a tool that we can use, and we probably need to embrace as we continue to see issues. And I'm guessing we all have seen some issues with staffing and needing to decrease staff. So there are certainly ways, even in the newsrooms and a lot of times outside of the newsrooms, that we can appropriately use AI as a beneficial tool, as long as we're not scared of it, and as long as we stick to our ethical boundaries. It's just important that we embrace it in an appropriate manner.
Yeah.
I can jump in. I mean, MinnPost, we're taking, I would say it's a cautious and mindful approach to AI, particularly, in a few very bare bones ways that, just sort of happened where, what are the menial tasks that take a lot of time that we can free up and just be more efficient with our time? So like transcription is a huge thing for reporters. They do all these interviews with sources and spend a lot of time transcribing those interviews now with different tools that can happen much more quickly and so forth. We think there are other efficiencies both in the newsroom, but also in our business team as well, in terms of having to be an additive, not a replacement for the people, but an additive to the people, so that we can focus on the more human-centered, human parts of the job. We're developing policies. We follow policy in terms of making sure that everything that we publish has a human eye on it before it's published. But as we just added a data journalist to our team as part of a bigger expansion this year, and that person went to a conference around AI. But there you're looking at huge data sets that would take hours upon hours upon hours of human review. Where can technology and AI make that much more efficient so that we can get to the part of serving people? And that to us is sort of, I think, the hallmark, the sort of North Star is around the people part of it. And it ties back to even what Vanan was saying in terms of trust. How do our audiences trust that we're doing? How are we transparent in how we use technology and AI in what we do? But fundamentally, this is a human-to-human endeavor to be successful in our mission and what we're doing. And so making sure that we're always kind of keeping that at the center and at the core of what we do.
That makes a lot of sense. I've done a fair amount of interviews over my career, working either for myself or with people I've worked with, and I've always never envied reporters who have to go and transcribe all of those long recordings about interviews and trying to figure it out. So I can see how AI may be helpful in cutting out some of those steps, but still keeping human contact.
Long gone are the days of you've got the pedal to like pause and like type out quickly as you are going. It's much more efficient and easier on people's lives.
That's good.
Go ahead, Tim.
Vanan, if you want to tag on, I was going to take it a little bit of a different direction with AI. So go ahead and follow up.
So from Sahan's perspective, we were fortunate that we are fortunate that we have a really, really awesome data journalist that works with us, and she was able to she worked with our reporters, and we were able to produce really two really amazing stories, and I'll put it in the link, in the chat box, doing precisely the thing that Tanner mentioned, which is like processing huge amounts of data scraping public records that would have taken much more longer time to manually comb through. We did a story around I think it was a Minnesota charter school that was awarded like $100 million contract, not really following rules. We were just the reporter was just able to focus and analyze the data a lot quicker. We had an amazing story around an opioid crisis, a lot of complex health data to understand who's most affected in Minnesota. And yeah, I'll share the stories, the links, but those are the things like that just really is able to elevate the work that reporters do. And we too also have a public charter that's out on our website and what we use AI for, what we don't use it for. Like Tanner mentioned, supporting the business team, I think that goes a long way. The last piece actually that I wanted to throw around technology and AI is that the public is starting to use AI as a search tool. So they're bypassing Google and Bing or even Safari for that matter, and they're using AI, and so that's actually a major shift for a lot of newsrooms because the traditional search can be a way how Sahan shows up in your feed. And so if people are no longer going to Google search or the Google algorithms no longer supporting that, so that's something that we have to really get ahead on how we incorporate Sahan into people's AI use themselves.
And Jake, if I might just jump in, because I think that's a great sort of segue into what I was thinking, which is at McKnight, we sort of have a unique vantage point because obviously we're not producing any journalism. We're supporting a lot of the partners in this work, like I mentioned earlier. But I think one of the fundamental questions that we always ask is who benefits? And I think the AI question is probably one of the most paramount questions that journalism is going to have to reckon with over the next 10 to 20 years, where there are absolutely undoubtedly efficiencies that it creates within newsrooms with ability to formulate and craft targeted advertisements that then can be sold in a really efficient way. Like there are sort of normal tons of really beneficial effects that it can have on the day-to-day operations of a newsroom. Where I get slightly concerned from sort of my grant making role and thinking about how it connects to policy and some of the broader trends around technology in general is we can go back to the current ongoing lawsuit between the New York Times and OpenAI that OpenAI was using thousands of articles and training their chatbots on New York Times generated content, right? So then OpenAI is profiting from content that the New York Times had invested significant resources into, and they're getting nothing, right? So we have to fundamentally think too, and it's not going to be one news organization that's going to solve this problem, but I fundamentally think it's an ownership question. So, I've had early conversations with the University of Minnesota around what could a journalism LLM look like, where journalism organizations own the data, they own the training tools, they actually own the large language model that then they can distribute profits on, and the money stays within the field versus being extracted out and given to tech companies, in Silicon Valley or wherever they might be. So there's obviously the day-to-day sort of how is it impacting your newsroom, but for the listeners on this call too, there's a much broader existential question around who owns data, who's making money off of your data, and who's being compensated and who's not being compensated, because we don't want to continue to contribute to this undercutting of journalism, which has started in the early 2000s.
Yeah. Alexis, I'd love to hear a little bit more from your perspective on AI. I'll be the first to admit that I'm a little bit AI skeptical still. I have not probably used it as many ways as it can make our lives more efficient as I could. But certainly your audience and students are probably more familiar with it or tend to be more quick to adopt. I'm curious if how the Daily is viewing or approaching AI and emerging technologies.
We're just having like a conversation about this the other day. The Daily, we approach it kind of skeptically as well. We don't as of like right now, we mostly use it for transcription. So when we're doing interviews, just because it helps a lot with like getting stories out. But then some people use it to go through, they use like Notebook LM or LLM to go through like large documents. But but it's just kind of like they kind of figure out how they use it like as students, and then they find a way that feels like kind of comfortable or like ethical to them. But it's like it's still something we approach cautiously.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I think it feels like it's evolving so fast. It's hard to not be somewhat cautious of it. Um, Tim, I'm going to go back to you here. I think you touched on a little of these numbers earlier, but the most recent State of Local News report, I think, found that we've lost about a third of newspapers, local newspapers across the country, and something like 200 or more counties now across the country are news deserts, right? It's essentially that they do not have even one source of local news. I think, if I'm understanding correctly, that Minnesota is still somewhat better than the national average. We still have a fair amount of local news, and I don't believe we have any counties that are specifically identified as news deserts, but correct me if I'm wrong. But I would love to hear a little bit more about Press Forward's initial investments in local media organizations, and if there's anything you're seeing as you engage with others across the country and funders in this. Is there anything unique about Minnesota's media and news system, news outlets, and what any specific learnings since Press Forward has really begun that you could share with us?
Yeah, of course. And to your point, Jake, around news deserts, I mean, it can be a little bit of a finicky sort of data point too, because there are often counties, and I was just reading somebody's take on this recently, that technically have a newspaper, but they're not locally owned, and it's what's called a ghost paper, which means they're republishing news under the guise of being a local paper, but there's no actual local reporters that are attending local council meetings, et cetera. And so I would estimate that even more than 20% of Americans are living within a news desert, and we just don't know. It's a much more pervasive problem that's really tough to measure, but that 20% is kind of a good starting point. So to some of I'll just kind of answer a couple things about Press Forward Minnesota, and how we're special or unique in Minnesota, which is true. And we love to feel special here because in many senses we are, but also we're doing really good work. So we were I believe the third local chapter to raise our hand. And so like I mentioned earlier in the call, there are over 40 local chapters now across the United States. Everywhere from their city level chapters to county level chapters. We here in Minnesota are a statewide chapter. So what that means is it's a philanthropic initiative that's housed at the Minnesota Council on Foundations, which is the philanthropy member organization that serves the whole state of Minnesota. I believe there are members in every county and distributed all around the state. And they are the home for the pooled fund and for also staffing the governance function of the initiative. So like I mentioned earlier, Tanner is on the host committee along with, I believe, I don't know the number off the top of my head, Tanner, you might know 12 others, something like that. Geographic diversity and also diversity of perspectives, not only in newsroom leaders like Tanner, but also civic leaders and business leaders of the like. So we have opened one grant round last year. We had our first grant round, and it was 14 organizations were recipients. And it was a very diverse set of grantees, from legacy newspapers and smaller communities to startup organizations to Hmong TV, for instance, who's serving the Hmong population in St. Paul. And so there's a really great sort of representation of what it means to be local news. And I think it's helpful as Press Forward continues to do this work is that we want to broaden sort of the understanding as local news and information beyond just a certain sort of platform. So we're not saying everything is about local newspapers or everything is about digital only nonprofits or what have you. It's actually about the whole tapestry that's woven together, because we understand that folks across the state get their news and information from different sources, and one is not better than the other. In fact, they're all creating this rich tapestry of information that is needed in this moment. So that's just a little bit about our first round of grantees. Moving into this year, we're going to have another open call. I put our website into the chat here. So if you're interested, folks who are listening online, please sign up for our newsletter. We're going to be announcing more about that in the coming months. But basically, Jake, to get all the way back to your earlier questions, what are some really early learnings, and maybe what are some areas that Minnesota is ahead of the curve? I would say, one, we're fortunate to have a strong philanthropic community here in Minnesota that understands that this is a priority issue. So out of those 40 chapters, very few have had grant making rounds. The fact that we're already onto our second means something and significant, and we're gathering more support from other foundations who have never funded local news. That is huge. We are growing the pie. We are helping support the industry and bringing new sort of folks into the fold. So that's one thing. The other thing I would say is Minnesota. If you look at it, and you alluded to this, we're doing relatively okay. Like there are really strong history from MinnPost to Sahan Journal to the Minnesota Star Tribune. To have a large regional newspaper that is relatively healthy is incredibly fortunate, and I'm not sure how many people here realize that it's actually quite a luxury in this day and age. And so what that means is that sure, maybe you could argue the need isn't as high as other places, but I would actually say that we have a lot of work to do at the grassroots community-based level. So I'm thinking about organizations like Sahan Journal. I'm thinking about news outlets that are serving our indigenous and tribal communities in greater Minnesota. I'm thinking of folks who are specifically covering undocumented communities in greater Minnesota as well. There's a massive sort of gap between what's being covered and what is still not showing up in the broader mainstream media. And so there's a lot of opportunity to create that connective tissue between some larger organizations and the new emerging startups. And the last thing I'll say on that is, I think there's a more collaborative spirit here in Minnesota than in many other states. And it can be challenging within new media and journalism, which used to be a pretty cutthroat competitive space, right? You're fighting for audience, your journalists are trying to get the first scoop, be the first to report on a story, into shifting mentality into more of sort of a solidarity mindset around like, actually, we're all better off together if we're thinking about how to collaborate better, to Heather's earlier point, how to reach new audiences in new and innovative ways, and how to reflect, frankly, what America and our collective we actually is. And this is, I think, the power of local journalism is not, it's great to cover the local sports and what's happening in your communities, but local journalism undeniably tells the stories of who we are as a country. It's not conflated with national politics. It's not conflated with special business interests. It actually tells the story of who we are. When we lose that sense and that grounding in real communities of who we are, we lose something pretty dangerous, and it brings us down a path or we lose something really important that brings us down a dangerous path of this backsliding into authoritarianism and polarization and all of the sort of trends that we're seeing today. So that's kind of my high level jumbled response, but I don't know. I'm sure other folks would have something to say on this too.
Yeah, that's great, Tim. I appreciate that. Not jumbled at all. I think it's evolving constantly, and that work I didn't realize that a lot of those other chapters are not even into their first round of grants. So that's really impressive to see how Minnesota has rallied and been able to move quickly. I think that's one thing we, in the constant back and forth of how exceptional are we, Minnesota exceptionalism, Minnesota's unique, Minnesota special. We all hear that, and there are certainly aspects of that are true, but that doesn't always tell the full story. So it's interesting to hear that. You mentioned this a little bit too, so I think I'm going to go in that direction. Trends or patterns that you're seeing among readers, subscribers, members. I'd be curious for any perspectives that folks have of what might have changed over time, right? What is your audience looking for? Are there particular types of stories that you're finding readers are more drawn to than others? Certainly some of this evolves, and kind of we always have to be reactive to what an audience is looking for. So I'm curious, as you look to the future, right? Planning the future of your organizations, Sahan continues to build. How does that look? And are you seeing any trends that you're trying to be responsive to make sure audiences continue to come to you as one of their sources of news?
Sure. And you mentioned Sahan, so I'm assuming the question goes for me
Sure,
first.
if you don't mind going ahead, that's great.
Yeah. No, not problem. No, not a problem. So, one of the, we last year we did our first audience survey. We just finished our second one, and parsing through the data, and one of the we learned a couple of things that was a little bit surprising. About some of our most engaged readers are second generation immigrants, I'm sorry, and young professionals of color. We had a hunch, but when we saw some of the data, it just allowed us to be more focused and double down on how we need to do a better job at reaching these audiences. So we are, those folks, they tend to get their news. They're not going to click on sahanjournal.com, although we would love for them to do that. But they use their social media. So we've doubled down on our efforts on our social media. Instagram, we've gotten a lot of traction in Instagram and in TikTok. The stories that we share, we are even more intentional about some of those things, and just trying to find ways to convey critical information that used to be shared with 1,000 words and now condensed to a 15-second video is actually very, very challenging. And so that is something that not just Sahan, but a lot of other newsroom organizations are trying to get better at. And so but we do know that is where we do need to grow. Whether if it's not this social media platform, it's going to be another. How do we deliver our value proposition in bite-sized chunks so that people, when they trust our content, then they will invest their time in reading that 1,000-word essay, that 1,200-word essay, right? That's not going to be, because sharing words are no longer just a way of getting people interested in our work. I think readers are still essentially they're drawn to how does this thing that's happening in such a somewhat, I wouldn't say global, but not real scale, like kind of up here, how does that impact me, right? Politics talk about, I think, is it dining table politics? I think that's that phrase there. I think newsroom also have to think about that. Like all the things that are happening, how does that impact the life of a person? And if we start doing a better job on how does that impact a youth, someone that's just starting to be a parent, someone who's a young professional, then we will get more engaged readers. Because right now, the attention is definitely on the national side. A lot of attention's on the national side. It's hard, it can be gossipy, but I love what Tim mentioned earlier. We need to find ways to draw people back to what's happening in their neighborhood, in their city, in their in their state, because that is the conversations tend to be more grounded and the impact is way, way more important.
Mm-hmm. Such a great point too, that you're making about how do you grab someone's attention, right? I think we're all bombarded with information in social media feeds, and I assume everyone on the panel here will agree with me that as you're looking through your social feeds, please actually click through and read the story. Don't just read the headline and share it. There's a lot more context to be had usually than 200 words or less in what's in a headline. But yeah, I mean, that's a real challenge, right? When it wasn't that long ago that we had like 4 sources of news and they were all basically telling us very similar things. And so now you've got to deal with that competition of lots of news sources, not always, maintaining the same kind of ethical standards or code of conduct of reporting that I know you all are. And that can be really tricky because you're competing with clickbait and you're competing with a lot of other things pulling for people's attention. I have to imagine it is a challenge on your minds every day about how you're continuing to keep that attention and readers focused on the real work that goes into good journalism and reporting in that in-depth stories and kind of customizing that for looking for those local angles when it seems like the national headlines are dominating what everyone's talking about.
Yeah, if I could just jump in, I mean, those are really great points. And certainly that digital media environment is much noisier, much more complex than it ever used to be. I always say, when we think about the idea of competition, it's not actually other news organizations, it's just the huge range of media that anybody can consume at any given time, and that is often, lighter in tone, or usually the things we're covering are not the kind of fun, happy-go-lucky stuff. And so we think about that in a few different ways. One, is that we're not just focused on problems, that we actually do think about solutions, and that we're equipping and empowering people. And when people feel like something is abstract or it's so big and so overwhelming, how can we make it relevant to their lives and have them focus kind of on the consequences of these big questions, these big issues? And how does that help them feel empowered to be involved, not sort of disempowered and disengaged from being involved in civic life, in public life? The other element that I think is really interesting, and I mentioned earlier that we're expanding our newsroom, which is really exciting. We have this big matching gift from a few donors in our group, and I'm happy to talk to anybody on the call who wants to talk about that. But it's exciting to be expanding at a time when often local news is contracting. But a big part of that expansion is around audience, not just being on these different platforms like Vanan was saying, and the great work his team does in terms of translating that core reporting to these different formats where people actually consume news, meeting them where they are. But also, how do we empower our journalists to be that kind of more person-to-person trust point? At a time when the institution of media is mistrusted, when media outlets are mistrusted, how do we forge those relationships, those connections, neighbor to neighbor, Minnesotan to Minnesotan? We care about this place. That's why we're digging into these issues and tracking them, and we want to help you do that too. How do we use those tools to make those person-to-person connections? Whereas, previously, particularly in print media, it was much more kind of like nameless, or not nameless, but faceless bylines and so forth, where we think that person-to-person contact is much more vital and central to the future of news.
Mm-hmm. Alexis, I am curious, I think this brings up a little bit for me of, you I think have a unique perspective on kind of students entering journalism, right? There's a lot of student journalists who are working at the Daily who are reporting on news relevant to the campus community. But at the same time, when there's this, as Tanner was kind of mentioning here, and it's come up a little bit in conversation, there's a lot of perceptions people have about news outlets, or a lot of conversation about, are there biases in news and in reporting? Sometimes I think bias is conflated with, well, I don't agree with that story, but I'm going to blame the outlet for reporting it in a certain way or covering it. But I guess bigger picture, I'm curious, what's the vibe with students entering journalism right now? Is there a skepticism? Is there a hesitancy? Is there growing interest? How are students, yourself included, looking at becoming future journalists and the world in which you're kind of entering?
I've asked like a few reporters and editors, and they're aware of the mistrust, and they're just kind of not discouraged from continuing, but they're just worried about being able to like get a job in journalism and then maintain said job and be able to like provide for themselves. Because oftentimes a lot of us hear, oh, you study journalism? Well, you're not going to make a lot of money. And it's like, well, okay. And so plus like kind of everything that's happening, like the job market isn't in a lot of people's favors right now. We had a lot of recent graduates this past spring, and they're kind of like struggling to find jobs in the industry. And I also know that AI is something that is kind of like, it makes young journalists a little fearful or like worried about like how people take in news and how they like receive news, because a lot of people don't understand the little like things to know. Oh, this is an AI thing, especially after one of the editors brought up how Vogue used an AI model, and it's like, oh, it's becoming so normalized to just use it in this like very general way, and people don't always know. So there's a bit just like worry that, oh, it's gonna replace us, or people will want it to replace journalists, and it's just like kind of a lot of fear, because we studied this for like 4 years, and now we're like, oh, um what are we gonna do? So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can only, I mean, I can imagine that's a real, it's, AI can be a useful tool if it also feels like it's yet another competitor in the space, right? Taking opportunity away from people like yourselves who spent a lot of time studying this and are trying to do the job well. That can be, I can imagine that would be really challenging. Heather, I'd love to kind of go back to you too on the perspective of local newspapers, and it's such a critical resource in communities, especially rural and greater Minnesota communities. I heard from you a little bit that obviously you're looking at more digital outlets and how can you use those tools to your advantage. But print media is still important. The print newspapers still matter. So just kind of tell us about your thoughts on the importance of community newspapers still being a relevant source for a lot of folks in, particularly in more rural or greater Minnesota communities.
Absolutely. And I would go as far as to say that a print product is important in every community, not just rural communities.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because how often do you hear about hacking? You can't hack a physical newspaper. You just can't do it.
Once it's printed, it's done, right?
Right, right. I could leave here today and they could hire a replacement for me tomorrow, and they could go back and say, I really hated all the work that Heather did, so I'm going to go into our system and change every article that she ever wrote. And then that's going to change everything online. Should they do that? No. But if they do that, it's changed online. However, that physical newspaper is still going to have the original article, how it was written, and you can't change that. That is what it is. That is what goes into the public record. That's what goes to the historical societies. That is what is archived. A physical newspaper is part of the historical record, and it is 100% necessary in order to maintain the history of the United States of America for us to have physical newspapers. It's not even a question in my mind that we have to maintain physical newspapers. Here, all of our news goes out online first. It collates into a print product, but if it's important, we're putting it in that print product. It's becoming part of America's history. It's becoming part of the history of Minnesota, of Ottertail County, of Fergus Falls or Pelican Rapids or Battle Lake or whatever community within the county that we're covering. It's part of that historical record. And without that physical print product, we cannot guarantee that that's happening. So it's absolutely important. And it's something that we all really need to keep in mind as we move forward, because maintaining that product is necessary, or we're going to become a country without history.
That's such an important point that I think often gets overlooked is, people are not necessarily subscribing or getting the print publication as much. Certainly we've seen some of those numbers go down in a lot of different circulations, but the newspaper as sort of that historical context is such a critical component, and there really are few ways. I love the point you made, right? Things online can be changed. A physical newspaper cannot. It is what it is, and it's there as that historical record and archive. That's really important. There was one other question too in the chat, and I will just encourage folks who are joining us and tuning in. Thanks so much. I've seen some great conversation going on in the chat, but I want to go back to one. Have any of you used citizen journalism as a way to fill any geographical or beat gap? So, and the person who has a question, whether independently or through the newspaper association, but just I thought I'd pose that question. Has anyone used any kind of citizen journalism approaches to helping augment your work or reporting?
And Jake, maybe also if someone wants to describe citizen journalism, I mean, I'm happy to, but I don't know if anyone else, if someone else maybe is using it within their newsroom, but I just think that would be helpful to define what that means.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think I guess my understanding, citizen journalism could really be someone who's not necessarily an employee of the outlet, but is covering or has a particular interest or focus on a topic. I mean, I think technically now there sort of says that we're all journalists because you can take a video and throw something on social media, right? So everybody has those tools at their disposal in a way that we didn't, 20 years ago or something. But I guess Yeah, maybe. So thinking outside of the box a little, not necessarily staff who may be on working for your outlet, but using others, contractors or citizens or other informed folks to help cover or augment any of your reporting. How do we see that playing out at all?
We use tips from the community all the time. We actually oftentimes like to start at that community level because what they want is what's going to get subscriptions, right? So, we love to get tips, and the community knows now that if they send us a photo, oh, I got this great photo at the fair, we're happy to use photos that are submitted to us. In fact, we have people now who will reach out to us and say, hey, I'm going to this festival this weekend. Do you want me to take photos for you? They love seeing their name in print in the newspaper. And, we're down to a smaller newsroom than we had even a year ago. And that helps us. And we have these relationships now with people in the community that they know exactly what we need because we've, asked them the questions, and they've asked us the questions. Well, what do you need from me in order to do this? A lot of people are happy to just offer to do it. We do have some community members who do things that we, we'll pay them like a freelancer, but they're a community journalist. It's a great way to do things. We have a submission form on our website where members of the community can go right to that submission form and send us photos, news tips, letters to the editor, what have you.
Yeah.
And we have people who have just been like, hey, my Facebook page is free reign. Go and take whatever you want. That's usually specifically around sports, like we have a specific mom who has a DSLR camera that's nicer than the ones we have in our newsroom, and she brings a ladder to the hockey rink and she climbs up so she can take pictures over the top of the boards, and her pictures are great, and she's like, take whatever you want. It's a great relationship to have. It saves us time, sometimes headache if we don't have the people that we need in order to cover all the things. It's really a great way, and people in the community love it. They love seeing that we're willing to work with people in the community to provide coverage that the community wants to see.
I love that. I mean, I think that's both a testament to the trust that your community has in you, but also I think we were talking about that earlier, so that the relationships and that human to human contact and piece of it, that's so important to all of this, that there's that kind of genuine, authentic engagement. I'll just highlight a couple of the things in the chat too, is folks who have regular columns, who cover the city council, the Documenters program, which is providing training for citizens to get trained around local journalism. That seems great. I hadn't heard about that, so I'm excited to look into it. Photographers. I guess this also brings up for me, and maybe another angle on this, is how are you all thinking about the role that, like, I know Tanner, at MinnPost, you've got Community Voices as a column that people write in and share on. So maybe not necessarily reporting on the news in so much as citizen journalism, but also that kind of commentary, opinion, editorial piece. How does that come into some of your calculations about the future? And are you seeing more or less, has there been any change in kind of that everyday person wanting to contribute their perspective to the news as well? I think that can sometimes be somewhat, I don't want to say controversial, but certainly I know a lot of times there have to be disclaimers, right? Outlets provide that, what's represented in the opinion pages are not that they are opinions of the writers. They are not positions of the outlet itself, but that can sometimes get conflated in people's minds. So I guess maybe I'll just kind of pose that as an open question. I'm curious how you're all approaching that. I know many of you have some aspect of that, but have you seen any changes or how people are viewing their, opportunity to provide their own commentary or perspective or opinion on a topic?
Yeah, I can jump in. I mean, Jake, like you said, we have Community Voices feature, which is, it's like our opinion pages, but from day one, we never had the mindset that, we should be conveying our opinion out to the world, and sort of really moving away from, I guess, like an ivory tower sort of approach to journalism and news, and really thinking about it is a convening, a gathering point for those community voices to come together And for us, we have that community voices feature, but we want to build on that, thinking about, are there shorter, more sort of entry level ways to bring more kind of voices from across Minnesota and the diversity of experiences and lived experiences in Minnesota from Minnesotans to really be a part of, what a lot of our reporting does is focus on sort of where is power, how is it being used, and the policy making. But, that policy goes out and it affects people. Let's have their voices included in that mix too, and really sort of having that sort of grassroots community connection to our reporting and what we do. And I would say the other piece of that is really looking at community engagement. And I think about it in terms of how do we be in touch with community, even if those voices don't show up in our reporting or on our site or through other social channels, but how do we surface up those needs to make sure we are finding those gaps in coverage and needs? We've got a really smart team. They're incredibly thoughtful, diligent, and always thinking of it expansively. But, there's experiences out there that they don't have or don't see. And so how do we have those connections with community to make sure we're surfacing up those needs and serving them?
Yeah. Thanks, Tanner. Alexis, go ahead.
I was gonna say for the daily, we have an opinions page, and kind of to Tanner's like comment or point about like we as a newsroom probably shouldn't be giving out our opinions. I think for the daily, it's a bit different because we are a college newspaper, so we like to allow students to get experience with different kinds of writing. That being said, we also do have that line where it's like, this is separate. We're trying to make it separate when we post about it on social media, to show that this isn't news, just because, especially now, a lot of opinion gets confused with news and it's not the same. And we also have like an op-ed submissions where people can, like faculty mostly use it to just talk about their opinions on something that's happening on campus. So I just think, yeah, kind of just having that place where people can voice their opinion and not feel, and we can like give them a platform to do so is always important.
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned that. That does feel like that kind of balance. I'm sure that you all juggle at times, right? Is you're both reporting on news and giving citizens and residents and readers the opportunity and the platform to share their perspective, maybe in reaction to something else you reported on. But that is different, right? That is sort of you create, you end up being that platform for opinion or perspective. That still, I think, is, in many ways relevant context, but not always going to be a part of necessarily the reporting on a story itself. So kind of augmenting that. And I'd highlight this one comment in the chat too, which I think is important, that citizen journalism can certainly be a valuable supplement or augmentation, but it's not, it shouldn't be viewed as an adequate or an unsustainable as a replacement for professional journalism. I think that's very true, right? That we wouldn't want to see that as an effort to replace it, but there certainly may be ways in which it can augment and help. So we're coming up on just about 10 minutes left on our time. This has been a fascinating conversation, and I'm so grateful to you all. So I'm going to kind of just transition us a little bit towards some more kind of maybe more, we've talked a lot about some of the challenges, certainly some good opportunities that have come up. But I'm curious for you all, in addition to obviously your own outlets, would you mind sharing with us other news sources you turn to? That where do you get your news? Where do you seek out other perspectives or angles on stories that you might not find in other places? Heather, can I put you on the spot to start?
Sure. Sorry, I lost my button for a second there.
No, it's okay.
Where do I find my sources and my ideas and everything? Well, everywhere. Social media, news tips from the community, about 572 on average emails a day.
572, that's a very specific average number. Wow.
I only know because I went on vacation for 10 days. So I took the average when I got home. Keep in mind, I have 2 newsrooms. So I also have a lot of connections within the community that'll just reach directly out to me and say, hey, did you know about this? Hey, did you hear about that? If we're having a really super slow, news week, I have about 4 people that I'm like, oh, I bet you anything if I reach out to them, they'll have something for me that I just haven't heard about. Facebook is fantastic for finding news leads. How accurate it is, that's another question, but that's our job, right?
That's why we need the professional journalists, right?
Exactly. Getting involved in the community groups for the communities that you're covering on social media is a great place. They're almost, I'm not going to say never, but almost never super accurate in the information that they're sharing, but it all stemmed from something.
Yeah.
So, and sometimes dispelling a rumor with social media, as prevalent as it is almost as important as covering it if it is true. Because if everyone in town thinks that, the mayor got a DWI, when actually the mayor was picking up their brother who got the DWI, that's something that may need to be cleared up a little bit within the community, and maybe appreciated by, voters and the city staff, the mayor, and even law enforcement, who's had to field all the phone calls from people who want to know the truth. So there are a lot of different ways to look at it. There are a lot of different places to get your sources.
Yeah.
I never hesitate to ask people if they've heard of anything. And at this point, I mean, my community is pretty small. But people will walk up to me at the grocery store. In fact, if I want to do my shopping alone, I travel to a town an hour away to do my grocery shopping because I cannot go in and out without somebody stopping me. And that's okay.
Telling you all the things you should be reporting on.
Yeah, either that or, hey, that column you wrote a year ago about this or that I may not even remember that I wrote anymore. Yeah, people love to talk to you about the work that you do, and that's just part of like the building relationships. You may not be on the clock, but you're kind of always on the clock with this job.
Yeah.
Because people love to talk to you about what you're doing and what's going on in the community. So, and you never know what's going to happen. The guy who called me a fascist and a Nazi now contacts me every time that he has advertising that he wants to do because, we figured it out. So now he likes me. So I can't see him anywhere without him coming up and talking to me.
There you go. You just proved our point about building relationships, challenging as that can be in some contexts. It is very important.
Yep. So, I mean, don't ever think that what you're doing is important or that there's a stupid question to ask anybody in the community, or that you're wasting time following something that may be a dead end, because it may be a dead end, but the fact that you asked somebody about it may mean that they come to you with something in the future. And that happens more often than it doesn't.
Yeah. Well, I think for our last question, I'd love to round it out with a hopeful note. So I'm curious, and I'll just go around the panel for this one. What is something that's happening in journalism and media right now that's energizing or inspiring to you or giving you hope? I mean, it's easy to focus on things that feel difficult or challenging, but there's certainly a lot of good things to point to as well. And so I'd love to, as we wrap this up, and I will just note for everyone listening in, this has been recorded and we will be sending it out via email, and you'll be able to watch it later or share it with others. So thank you for tuning in. I think it's been a wonderful conversation. So maybe if I can just go around, Vaughn, and I'll start with you, if you don't mind. Anything that's energizing you or inspiring you or giving you hope in the field of journalism and media right now?
You're catching me on a week that's kind of like challenging for me to answer this question wholeheartedly, but
Sure.
it took me a while to dig deep here. But you know, I think it's I don't know if it's a paradox, but the events, the things that have been happening to communities in the last 6 months, has shown me also how much people care about it. So on one hand, you see terrible things happening, but then you also see a lot of people galvanizing, wanting to know more about, wanting to have more information, wanting to have more agency on what they can do and how they can activate around journalism and news, right? And I'm talking about not just communities of color, but just generally speaking, the citizenship. So that is really, really has been given me and my team a lot of energy. Last couple of weeks, internal, so that's more of an external thing. What internally, what's been giving me hope is internally is from the industry perspective. I'm meeting more and more newsroom leaders that are interested in breaking the mold of what's been going on from a traditional perspective. Testing new things, wanting to embrace new technology. I'm new to the industry, and I was very surprised at how traditional journalism was when I first got into it, but very surprised by it. But I'm meeting more and more folks that are, they are just willing to test out new things and challenge the orthodox of how things have been done in the past.
Thanks. Appreciate that.
Yeah.
Alexis, can I ask you next?
Yeah. For me, it's being a journalism student, working at the Daily, and just being around other young journalists and kind of having similar conversations about journalism, the state of journalism, and like what can we do. That gives me hope, just because it's like the Daily still gets a lot of applications and people are still signing up for the journalism program, and we haven't all just like kind of given up and just accepted like what's happening. So that gives me hope.
That's wonderful. Tanner?
It's working arm in arm with other people who care and who have clarity, and I guess I would call it a moment, or maybe in journalists, like a period of crisis and challenges, whether that's the team here that I'm lucky enough to work with at MinnPost, whether, and we've talked about the host committee for Press Forward Minnesota, that group. I mean, it's a really smart group of people who, we talk about really tough stuff and challenging stuff. But the group is provocative, there's disagreements, but always kind of very forward-looking. And, the Institute of Nonprofit News makes that an even broader community where it is really looking at, okay, these are the challenges. They feel less overwhelming when we're looking at them together as opposed to alone. How can we work together? How can we share ideas? How can we share resources to really push through, to innovate, and to not only survive as businesses, even nonprofit businesses, but really serve our communities in new ways. That public value is just even more clear, and that impact is even stronger.
Yeah. Tim, and then Heather, I'll give you the last word.
Nobody said this panel yet. This panel gives me hope, which is true. And I just want to say too, and I can't believe I'm waiting this long to call it in, but press freedom is under attack in this country, and I don't have any illusions or any niceties or any way to talk around it. We're all, the work of everyone in this room and beyond is under threat from many vantage points. So I find hope in the journalists and the news organizations who are standing up and digging for truth, even in the wake of of potential personal consequences of being sued, of being pulled into political conversations they never were asked or trying to pursue in the first place. Those folks are giving me hope, and I continue to hope that we will resource them both within philanthropy and outside of philanthropy, but everyone on this call. And I think I'll just say last thing is John Pelfrey from MacArthur always says, how many of you have Netflix subscriptions? And everyone in the room will raise their hand. And I think if you have a Netflix subscription, you should also subscribe to at least one or two of your favorite local news sources that you're reading all the time. And if we do that, we'll be in a lot better place.
I talk a lot and I agree with everybody in what they said that they've been excited about. And one thing that a lot of people don't get excited about, but I tend to, is change. And there's a lot of change happening in the newspaper industry right now. And instead of looking at it and being fearful, I look at it and I get really excited. And I encourage everybody to challenge your own mindset, to look at everything in a positive light instead of a negative light, and look at the opportunity for change and to see how you can make that into something good instead of looking at it with an overwhelming sense of dread or fear.
I can't imagine a better way to end. We are at time. I want to, first of all, please everyone join me in thanking our panel for sharing their perspectives and their experience. This has been wonderful. If you enjoy programming like this, obviously we at Citizens League appreciate your support, but perhaps more importantly, support local news. All of these folks are doing great work, and we need them as a part of our community. So to sort of amplify Tim's point there at the end, if you have a Netflix subscription or frankly any other streaming service subscriptions, you should also be subscribing to your local news. So thank you very much for your time today. We really appreciate the conversation. Hope you all have a great afternoon, and stay tuned for future conversations like this from Citizens League. Thanks a lot. Take care.
Thank you all.
Thanks.